Listen closely, because this is where most people misunderstand what betrayal really does, not just to you, but to the person who committed it. You think they walked away free. You think they escaped the consequences. But the truth is, they didn't escape anything. They imprisoned themselves. Because when someone betrays you and then avoids responsibility, they're not protecting themselves, they're weakening themselves. Every time a person runs from truth, they lose a piece of their power. Every time they suppress guilt instead of facing it, they disconnect further from who they are meant to be. And here's the deeper truth. Growth only exists where truth is faced. Avoidant psychology is built on one simple illusion. If I don't face it, it doesn't exist. But reality doesn't work that way. Pain ignored becomes pain multiplied. Guilt buried becomes identity fractured. And over time, they don't just lose relationships, they lose themselves. Now understand this, betrayal is not just an action, it is a test of character. And when someone fails that test and refuses to confront it, they lock themselves in a cycle. Avoid, distract, numb, repeat, no healing, no evolution, just survival. But you are different because you're here seeking understanding. You're here facing the pain. And that means you are already doing what they could not. You are growing. Let me tell you something powerful. The one who feels the pain and transforms it becomes unstoppable. The one who avoids the pain becomes trapped by it. You don't need revenge. You don't need closure from them. You don't need them to understand what they did, because your power does not come from their apology. It comes from your decision to rise, your decision to learn, your decision to turn pain into purpose. See, betrayal didn't break you. It revealed you. It showed you your standards. It showed you your strength. It showed you that you are someone who values truth, loyalty, and growth. And those who run from those values, they don't win in the long run. They shrink. They settle. They repeat the same cycles until life forces them to face what they've been avoiding. But you get to choose differently. You get to take this moment and say, I will not become bitter. I will become better. I will not close my heart. I will strengthen it. I will not chase people who run from truth. I will become the kind of person truth is drawn to, because real power is not in controlling others. It is in mastering yourself. And when you master your emotions, your mindset, your purpose, you reach a place where no betrayal can define you, only refine you. So let them avoid, let them run, let them stay stuck in their patterns. You move forward. You grow. You evolve into someone so strong, so clear, so aligned, that what once hurt you becomes the very thing that built you. And one day, you won't even ask why they couldn't recover, because you'll be too busy living at a level they never had the courage to reach. At the core of avoidant behavior lies a powerful instinct, the need to escape emotional discomfort at all costs. When something painful happens, like betrayal, the natural human response for growth is to confront it, feel it, understand it, and ultimately transform through it. But for someone wired with avoidance, that process feels threatening. Instead of leaning into the discomfort, they instinctively pull away from it. They distract themselves, detach emotionally, or even convince themselves that the situation isn't as serious as it really is. This is not healing. It is emotional evasion. What's important to understand is that this escape mechanism is not always conscious. Many people who operate this way don't wake up and decide to avoid responsibility or emotional depth. It's a pattern built over years, often rooted in early experiences where facing emotions may have led to rejection, shame, or vulnerability they weren't equipped to handle. So their mind adapts. It creates a shortcut. If pain arises, exit immediately. And over time, this becomes their default response to any emotional challenge. Now here's where it becomes destructive. When someone betrays you, there is an internal rupture that occurs within them as well. Whether they admit it or not, they feel the weight of what they've done. There's guilt, conflict, and a deep internal tension between their actions and their sense of self. But instead of resolving that tension through accountability and growth, they escape it. They avoid conversations, they distance themselves from you, and most importantly, they distance themselves from their own truth. This avoidance might give them temporary relief, but it comes at a cost. Because emotions that are not processed do not disappear, accumulate. The guilt they refuse to face doesn't vanish. It lingers beneath the surface, shaping their future behavior, their relationships, and their self-worth. Over time, they may become more distant, more closed off, and more disconnected, not just from others, but from themselves. Avoidance also blocks learning. When you face pain, you gain insight. You understand what went wrong, what needs to change, and how to grow into a better version of yourself. But when you run from pain, you rob yourself of that transformation. You stay stuck in the same patterns, repeating the same mistakes, because you never took the time to truly understand them. And here's the paradox. The very thing they are trying to escape, pain, is the only path to freedom. By avoiding it, they actually deepen their suffering. It becomes more subtle, more internal, and more persistent. It shows up as anxiety, restlessness, dissatisfaction, or an inability to form deep, meaningful connections. They may appear fine on the surface, but internally there's a lack of peace. Meanwhile, the person who chooses to face the pain, to sit with it, to learn from it, person evolves. They gain emotional strength, clarity, and resilience. They build a deeper connection with themselves and others because they are no longer afraid of truth. So understand this clearly. Avoidance is not protection. It is postponement. It delays the inevitable confrontation with reality. And the longer it is delayed, the heavier it becomes. The real path to healing is not in running away from what hurts, but in turning toward it with courage. Because only when you face the pain can you release it. Only when you acknowledge the truth can you transform it. And only when you stop escaping can you finally become free. There is something deeply confronting about taking full responsibility for your actions, especially when those actions have caused pain to someone else. It requires a level of honesty that most people are not prepared for. It means standing in front of the truth without excuses, without justification, and without hiding behind stories that make you feel safe. For someone with avoidant tendencies, this is one of the most uncomfortable experiences imaginable. Not because they don't understand what they did, but because facing it threatens the image they have of themselves. Every person carries an internal identity, a story about who they are. I'm a good person. I don't hurt people. I'm justified in my actions. When betrayal happens, that identity is shaken. There's a contradiction between their behavior and their self-image. And resolving that contradiction requires accountability. It requires them to say, I was wrong. I caused harm. I need to change. But for someone who avoids emotional discomfort, this level of ownership feels like an attack on their ego. So what do they do instead? They protect the identity at all costs. They rationalize their actions. They shift blame. They minimize the impact. They might say, it wasn't that serious, or you're overreacting, or I had my reasons. These are not just random excuses. They are defense mechanisms designed to preserve their sense of self. Because admitting the full truth would force them to confront a version of themselves they are not ready to accept. But here's the deeper issue. When someone avoids accountability, they also avoid growth. Accountability is not punishment. It is the gateway to transformation. The moment a person truly owns their actions, they gain clarity. They see where they went wrong, why it happened, and what needs to change. That awareness becomes the foundation for becoming better. Without it, there is no evolution, only repetition. Avoidant individuals often confuse accountability with shame. They believe that admitting fault means they are fundamentally flawed or unworthy, so they run from it. But in reality, avoiding accountability creates a deeper, more lasting form of shame. It lingers beneath the surface, unspoken and unresolved, slowly eroding their confidence and self-respect. And this fear doesn't just affect one situation. It becomes a pattern. If they cannot take responsibility for one betrayal, they are unlikely to take responsibility in future conflicts. They carry the same avoidance into every relationship, every challenge, every moment that demands honesty. Over time, this creates a cycle where problems are never truly resolved. They are only buried. What's even more important to understand is that accountability requires emotional strength. It takes courage to say, I made a mistake. It takes maturity to face the consequences of your actions. And it takes self-awareness to recognize that growth is more important than protecting your ego. Avoidant individuals often lack these tools, not because they are incapable, but because they have never developed them. So instead of leaning into discomfort, they retreat from it. Instead of confronting the truth, they reshape it. Instead of growing, they remain stuck. But here's the truth that changes everything. The ego you are trying to protect is the very thing holding you back. Real power does not come from being right all the time. It comes from being real. It comes from having the strength to face your flaws, learn from them, and rise stronger because of them. The moment you stop defending your mistakes and start owning them, you step into a completely different level of growth. And for those who choose avoidance, that level remains out of reach because you cannot heal what you refuse to acknowledge. You cannot transform what you refuse to see. And you cannot become better while protecting a version of yourself that is built on denial. So the fear of accountability may feel like protection in the moment, but in the long run, it becomes a prison. When guilt is not acknowledged, it does not simply disappear. It transforms. It goes underground into the deeper layers of the mind where it begins to influence behavior in subtle but powerful ways. For someone who has betrayed another person, guilt is a natural emotional response. It's a signal that something within them recognizes the misalignment between their actions and their values. But when that signal is ignored or suppressed, it doesn't resolve. It intensifies in silence. Instead of facing that guilt, an avoidant individual distances themselves from it. They push it away by avoiding the person they hurt, avoiding conversations about what happened, and even avoiding environments that remind them of their actions. On the surface, this looks like indifference or coldness. It may seem like they don't care. But in reality, it's often the opposite. The weight of what they feel is so uncomfortable that the only way they know how to cope is by creating distance. This is where the shift happens. Guilt, when processed, can lead to empathy, accountability, and growth. But guilt, when suppressed, turns into avoidance, disconnection, and emotional withdrawal. The person begins to associate not just the event, but the person they hurt with discomfort. So instead of moving closer to repair the damage, they move further away to escape the feeling. And this creates a painful paradox. The very person they should be communicating with, apologizing to, and making things right with becomes the person they avoid the most. Not because that person is the problem, but because that person represents the truth they are unwilling to face. Every interaction becomes a mirror reflecting their actions, and instead of looking into that mirror, they turn away from it. Over time, this distance becomes normalized. What started as a temporary coping mechanism becomes a long-term pattern. They justify the distance by telling themselves stories. It's better this way, or we're just not compatible, or things weren't going to work anyway. These narratives help reduce the internal tension, but they also deepen the disconnection from reality. The cost of this suppression is significant. When guilt is not processed, it doesn't just affect one relationship, it affects the person's entire emotional world. They may become more guarded, less open, and less capable of forming deep connections. There's an underlying discomfort they carry, even if they can't fully explain it. It shows up as restlessness, irritability, or an inability to feel truly at peace. And perhaps most importantly, suppressed guilt prevents closure, not just for the person who was hurt, but for the one who caused the hurt. Without facing what happened, there is no resolution. There is no learning. There is no transformation. The experience remains unfinished, lingering in the background, shaping future decisions and reactions. This is why avoidance is not healing. It is postponement. The guilt remains, waiting to be acknowledged. And the longer it is ignored, the more it influences behavior in unconscious ways. It may lead to repeated patterns of hurting others, not out of intention, but out of unresolved internal conflict. But when guilt is faced, truly faced, it becomes something entirely different. It becomes a teacher. It opens the door to empathy, to understanding the impact of one's actions, and to making conscious changes. It allows a person to reconnect with their values and rebuild their integrity. The tragedy is that avoidant individuals rarely give themselves that opportunity. In their attempt to escape discomfort, they also escape growth. They trade temporary relief for long-term disconnection. And so what looks like distance on the outside is often a reflection of something unresolved on the inside. A quiet struggle with guilt that was never given the chance to heal. And a growing separation not just from others, but from their own emotional truth. One of the most overlooked truths about avoidant behavior is that it is not always driven by arrogance or lack of care. It is often driven by a lack of emotional education. Many people were simply never taught how to process difficult emotions in a healthy way. They were never shown how to sit with discomfort, how to express vulnerability, or how to navigate the complexity of guilt, regret, and pain. So when life presents them with emotionally intense situations like betrayal, they don't have the internal tools required to respond constructively. Think about it for a moment. Emotional strength is not something people are born with fully developed. It is learned, it is modeled, it is practiced over time. If someone grows up in an environment where emotions are dismissed, punished, or ignored, they adapt by shutting down. If expressing feelings led to rejection or conflict, they learn that vulnerability is unsafe. And over time, they build a protective system that prioritizes emotional survival over emotional growth. So when they hurt someone and the weight of that action begins to surface internally, they are faced with emotions they don't know how to handle. Guilt feels overwhelming. Shame feels paralyzing. Honest communication feels threatening. Instead of engaging with those feelings, they retreat from them, not because they don't matter, but because they don't know what to do with them. This is where the misunderstanding often happens. From the outside, it can look like they don't care, like they are cold, detached, or even indifferent to the pain they caused. But internally, it may be a very different experience. There can be confusion, inner conflict, and emotional overload. The problem is not the absence of feeling. It is the absence of skills to process those feelings effectively. Without those skills, avoidance becomes their only strategy. It's the only way they know how to reduce the intensity of what they're experiencing. They distract themselves. They stay busy. They avoid deep conversations. They suppress anything that brings them back to the emotional discomfort. And while this might create temporary relief, it prevents any real resolution from taking place. Emotional processing requires specific abilities: the ability to identify what you're feeling, the courage to sit with it without escaping, the clarity to understand why it's there, and the willingness to take responsibility where needed. These are not simple tasks. They require self-awareness, patience, and practice. And if someone has never developed these capacities, expecting them to suddenly handle a complex emotional situation with maturity is unrealistic. But here's the critical point. Lack of emotional tools explains the behavior. It does not excuse it. Every person, at some point, is responsible for their own growth. The moment you become aware that you struggle with emotions, that you tend to avoid difficult situations, that you shut down instead of stepping up, that is the moment you are called to evolve. Because staying in that pattern doesn't just affect you, it affects everyone you interact with. Avoidance might protect you from discomfort in the short term, but it limits your ability to experience deep connection, trust, and authenticity in the long term. Relationships require emotional presence. They require honesty, accountability, and the ability to work through challenges together. Without the tools to do that, every relationship becomes fragile, easily broken by conflict or discomfort, and so the cycle continues: distance, disconnection, unresolved issues, repeating over and over again. But the truth is, emotional tools can be learned at any stage of life. Self-awareness can be developed, communication can be practiced, emotional resilience can be built. It requires intention, effort, and a willingness to face what has been avoided for so long. Because real growth begins the moment a person stops saying, "I can't handle this," and starts asking, "How can I learn to?" At a certain point, the human mind makes a quiet but powerful decision. Do I choose comfort or do I choose growth? For someone operating from avoidance, that decision is almost always made in favor of comfort. Not because they don't want to grow, but because growth demands discomfort. And discomfort is exactly what they've trained themselves to escape. Self-protection becomes their priority. Emotional safety, or at least the illusion of it, takes center stage. They begin to organize their behavior around minimizing pain rather than maximizing progress. And while that might feel like strength on the surface, it is actually a limitation that keeps them confined within a very narrow version of themselves. When betrayal enters the picture, this tendency intensifies. Facing what they've done would require vulnerability. It would require admitting fault, feeling guilt, and risking rejection or confrontation. All of that feels unsafe to an avoidant mind. So instead of stepping into the fire of growth, they step away from it. They choose distance over dialogue, silence over truth, and comfort over transformation. But here's the cost of that choice. Every time you prioritize short-term comfort over long-term growth, you reinforce a pattern that becomes harder to break. The mind learns through repetition. When avoidance works in the sense that it reduces immediate discomfort, the brain registers it as a successful strategy. It says, "This kept me safe. Do it again." And so the next time a difficult situation arises, the same response is triggered automatically. Over time, this creates a deeply ingrained habit where discomfort is not a signal to grow, but a signal to retreat. This is how people become stuck. Not because they lack potential, not because they are incapable of change, but because they have conditioned themselves to avoid the very experiences that would lead to growth. They stay within the boundaries of what feels familiar and manageable, even if those boundaries are limiting and unfulfilling. And the tragedy is, growth is always on the other side of discomfort. Every breakthrough, emotional, mental, or relational, requires stepping into something that feels uncertain. It requires facing fears, having difficult conversations, and confronting parts of yourself that are uncomfortable to acknowledge. When someone consistently avoids these moments, they miss the opportunities that would expand them. Instead, they remain in a cycle of self-preservation. They protect themselves from pain, but in doing so, they also protect themselves from progress. They may maintain a sense of temporary stability, but it comes at the cost of depth, connection, and personal evolution. In relationships, this pattern becomes especially limiting. True connection requires openness. It requires the willingness to be seen, to be honest, and to work through challenges together. When self-protection dominates, walls are built instead of bridges. Conflict is avoided instead of resolved. And over time, relationships lose their depth and authenticity, but the deeper issue goes beyond relationships. It affects identity. When a person continually chooses comfort over growth, they begin to see themselves as someone who can't handle difficult situations. Their confidence shrinks. Their belief in their own resilience weakens. They become more dependent on avoiding discomfort and less capable of navigating it, and yet the truth remains. The capacity for growth is always there. The moment someone decides to face discomfort instead of fleeing from it, everything begins to change. Strength is built. Awareness expands. New possibilities emerge. But that shift requires a conscious decision, a decision to stop prioritizing immediate relief and start investing in long-term transformation. Because real safety is not found in avoiding life's challenges. It is found in becoming strong enough to face them. And until that shift happens, self-protection will continue to act as a barrier, not just against pain, but against the very growth that could lead to freedom. Part pods are not created overnight, and they are not broken overnight either. Every behavior that is repeated, especially in moments of emotional intensity, begins to carve a pathway in the mind. The brain is designed for efficiency, so it learns from what you do most often. If someone repeatedly avoids discomfort, avoids accountability, avoids emotional depth, that avoidance doesn't stay a one-time reaction. It becomes a conditioned response. It becomes automatic. At first, it may seem small. One difficult conversation avoided. One moment of guilt pushed aside. One situation escaped instead of addressed. But then it happens again, and again, and again, each time reinforcing the same internal message, "This is how I deal with things." Over time, that message solidifies into identity. It's no longer just something they do. It becomes who they are. This is the power of pattern reinforcement. When a person betrays someone and then chooses avoidance instead of accountability, they are not just escaping that single moment, they are strengthening a behavioral loop. The next time they face conflict, the same instinct will arise. The next time they feel guilt, the same reaction will take over. It becomes predictable. It becomes familiar. And because it's familiar, it feels safe, even if it's damaging. This is how cycles are formed. They move from one situation to another, repeating the same emotional habits, often without even realizing it. Relationships may change, circumstances may shift, but the underlying pattern remains the same. Avoid, disconnect, suppress, move on, without ever truly resolving anything. And because nothing is resolved, everything is carried forward. The danger of this cycle is not just that it continues, it deepens. Each repetition makes the pattern more ingrained and harder to break. The emotional distance grows. The ability to confront truth weakens. The discomfort associated with accountability becomes even more intense because it has been avoided for so long. What could have been addressed early with honesty and courage now feels overwhelming and almost impossible to face. And so the person stays trapped, not by external forces, but by their own reinforced habits. They may wonder why the same problems keep appearing in their life, why relationships don't last, why they feel disconnected or unfulfilled. But the answer lies in the patterns they have built and continue to repeat. Until those patterns are interrupted, nothing truly changes. Breaking a pattern requires awareness first. It requires the recognition that this is not just a one-time situation, this is a cycle. And then it requires a conscious decision to respond differently, even when it feels uncomfortable, unfamiliar, and difficult. Because the moment you interrupt a pattern, you create a new possibility. Instead of avoiding, you engage. Instead of suppressing, you express. Instead of running, you stay and face what needs to be faced. At first, it feels unnatural. The mind resists it because it's not what it's used to. But with repetition, a new pattern begins to form, one based on courage, honesty, and growth. This is how transformation happens. But for someone who never reaches that point of awareness or willingness, the cycle continues indefinitely. They remain stuck in the same loops, experiencing the same outcomes, wondering why nothing changes. Because patterns don't change on their own. They change when a person decides to change them, and until that decision is made, avoidance will continue to reinforce itself quietly, consistently, and powerfully, keeping them in a state of emotional stagnation where real recovery, real growth, and real freedom remain just out of reach.